Hey folks, we are doing this last lesson of Unit 1, composing functions. This is actually kind of fun once you get it. It's a little sneaky at the beginning, but once you get it down, it's actually kind of enjoyable, in my opinion. All right, so here's the idea. I mean, we already know that when I write f of x and let's say I change that to f of negative 1, what does that mean I'm going to do with this function? I'm going to plug in negative 1. So what happens when you're composing functions is you have a function inside of another function. So I'm going to first, just like we always do, parentheses are the strongest. So I go inside. The innermost parentheses are just negative 1, so there's nothing I can do with that. Then the next set of parentheses say f of negative 1. Well, f is the name of this function here. So if I want to figure out what f of negative 1 is, I can evaluate that by plugging in negative 1 in for x. So let's evaluate that first. So we would have f of negative 1, which would equal negative 3 times negative 1 squared, subtract 2 times negative 1, subtract 5. This is something I can clean up. What's that? That's 1, so that's gone. That makes that a positive. That's minus 8 plus 2, negative 6. Okay, so that's what f of negative 1 is. That output, we call that an output. This negative 1 is the input. This output now becomes the new input for G. So I'm now going to take this, and I'm going to now input it into this whole thing. So f of negative 1 is going to get replaced by negative 6. So now our statement will say G of, well, we just figured out that f of negative 1 was negative 6. And G of negative 6 is something that we can figure out based on our G equation. So G of negative 6, dang it, I wrote it twice, I don't know why. 3 times the quantity, negative 6, subtract 2, that's negative 18, subtract 2 is negative 20. So negative 20 is our final answer. That's our output, okay? So we've got this is our first input. That input has an output. Then that output becomes the new input in the other function, which then gives us our final output of negative 20. So if you look at the next one is just another way to write this. So this is the compose symbol, just like we have a symbol for multiply and add and subtract and divide. Composing, the symbol is this open circle. If you want to, I used to always just rewrite this because I understood the parentheses better. So the first thing I did when I saw that open circle was to convert it into the format that made more sense to me. All right, so I've got to do G of 6 first. So G of 6, I would plug that in. That's 18. Take away 2 is 14. So now I'm going to find f of, right, 18 take away 2 is 16. Let's try that. How about that? Now I want to figure out what f of 16 is. I need my calculator to do this. So I'm going to type in negative 3. So my function is negative 3 times the quantity. We figured out that our new input was 16 squared. Subtract 2. Our input is 16. And then subtract 5, and I get negative 805. No, I don't want to say that. I want to just write it as negative 805. All right, so hopefully you've got the idea. Now I'm going to do the same thing, except they give us less information, so I'm not going to be able to answer. My answer will not be as specific. It won't be a specific number. It'll actually be another function. So now I'm taking f of g of x. So they didn't tell me what x was, so I'm going to have to take this whole expression and I'm going to have to sub that into the f function. So now that's going to say negative 3 times the quantity of 3x subtract 2 squared, subtract 2 times the quantities 3x subtract 2, subtract 5. Notice what I did here is I took out the x's in this equation and replaced them just like we did here. This says f of g of x. That means all these x's are going to replace with the g of x function. Now I will calculate this. Don't forget this is a little bit sneaky, so I would recommend highlighting this. Just a reminder. that this is not 9x squared plus 4. You have to write this one twice and distribute it. 3x subtract 2, 3x subtract 2. Start to distribute, so that would be 9x squared. Then that becomes minus 6x, and then another minus 6x is a minus 12x. Then minus 2 is positive 4. Now I would go back and sub that in. So I now have negative 3 times the quantity, 9x squared, subtract 12x, plus 4, subtract 2 times the quantity, 3x subtract 2, minus 5. And then I will distribute. So that's negative 27x squared, positive 36x, subtract 12. And I would distribute the negative 2, negative 6x, plus 4, subtract 5. And then now let's organize things. There's negative 27x squared. 36x's minus 6x's is 30x. Minus 2, let's do this one first. 4 minus 5 is negative 1. That'd be negative 13. There we go. So notice when we don't have an initial input for x, we're going to get an answer that still has x's in them. In these two, we gave you an input, and then we went from there. So this is when we evaluate composing functions. We evaluate them when we're given equations. We're going to do the same idea, but now we're going to do it using tables. So f of g of 2. So my first input is 2. So I'm going to go to 2. Maybe I will draw the... I know it'll get kind of confusing after this if I draw a lot of this, but hopefully I'll do it maybe once. And then the rest of them I'll just point. So when g of 2, that means x is 2. So I go to the 2 column. I go down. We want to evaluate g first, so I'm going to go down to the g position. So now I'm at 6. Now that new output becomes my new input for f. So my input of 2 gave me an output of 6. That becomes my new input. So now I'm going to go up to 6, and then I'm going to go to the f column, and I would get negative 5. I guess I didn't end up highlighting it after all. All right, let's try another one. F of 0. So 0 is my first input. So I go to the 0 column. I go to F. F is 4. That's my output. That means that 4 becomes my new input. And then now I want to calculate G, so I would then get 2. F of 6. So my first input is 6. My first output is negative 5. Then that becomes my new input. That means my new output is 0. I'm trying to pick a good color that I haven't used yet, but I can't find one. Here we go. So just because there's 3 of them doesn't change the pattern. We're still going to do f of negative 8, get an output, that becomes the input of g, get a new output, that becomes the input of f again. So negative 8 is my first input, f is my output, so that's 6. Then 6 becomes my input, but we're going to g this time, so that's 4. 4 becomes my input, so we're going to f, so this would become negative 2. All right, I would encourage you to pause at this point. See if you can do the next 4 on your own. All right, let's see how you did. I'm going to go a little bit faster. X is negative 2, so that my F is negative 8. Negative 8, then I would go to G, so this one should be 11. G is 4, so my input is 4. My output is 2. That becomes my new input is 2, but we're going to G again, so this should be 6. My input is negative 5. I'm going to the G function, so that's negative 2. That becomes my new input, negative 2. I'm going to the F function, so that would become negative 8. And then last but not least, G of F of 11. So 11 is my input. My output is 11. That becomes my input again. So I'm going to go to 11 again. Then I'm going to go to G, which is negative 5. Go to negative 5, go to G, and we get negative 2. So we've done composing functions with equations. We've composed functions given in their table format, and now we're going to compose them using our graphing format. It's the same idea. I'm going to take, this is my input, in other words, my x value when it comes to a graph, and then I'm going to go to the function. So make sure that you're paying attention to which function is which. This is the f function. Sometimes some people like to highlight these. So that's my f function. And then my other function is my g function. So we're taking a look at this first scenario. We're going to go to x is 0. I'm going to f, which is yellow, so that output would be 3. I'm looking at the height. So this is my x, and these are going to be my y values. So I have a height of 3. So now I've got to go to 3 on the x, and I've got to trace to the g function, so it should be -4. Let's try that again. F of 4, so my input is 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I trace to the f function, I get a height of 3. That means my new input is 3, and that goes to a height of 0. G of f of g of 1. That means I go to 1. I'm going to my g function, which is pink in this case. That's 4. Now that 4 becomes my new input, and I'm going to the f function. That's 3. That means 3 is my new input, and then I go to the g function, which is -4. I'm going to encourage you to pause here and try to do the next 3 on your own. All right, let's see how you did. So we would do g of 2. 2 to g would be 2, and then 2 again would be 2. So that one's pretty easy. Right? 2 was my input, goes to a height of 2. So that output becomes my new input, which is 2. That goes to g again, so that's 2. Yep, I buy it. F of g of 2, so I go to 2, go to g again, so that's 2. But now when I go to 2, I need to go to f, so that should be -1. And then our last example, let's take a look at f of g of 0. So 0, then I need to go to the g function, so that's 2. So 2 becomes my new input. Now I go to f, which is -1. That means I need to go to -1 and go to f again, so it should be 8. All right, so like I said, pretty fun. I think it's kind of interesting. Simple process and satisfying when you get there. So, all right, good luck. Go get them.